Next speaker, what you're talking about, it was Mike Dickison, who will be speaking about why saving species and resurrecting species are the same and why it matters. Mike is from the Whanganui Regional Museum.
Yes. Kia ora koutou katoa, no Mike Dickison o Tautahio. It's nice to be up here. I'm from Whanganui. We say it Whanganui, not Whanganui, but you can say it how you like, as long as it's one of those two. I'm here to talk, I guess, about social license to operate. That was really nice to point out to Neil that that's what I'm talking about. I was listening to you and I thought, oh, that sounds good. I'd like to hear that talk. Oh, it's up next. That's me. So, hurrah. I don't have to even rewrite my slides. So I'm more a biologist by trade, and I work in a museum, but we'll see why I'm talking about genetics. First, we've got a small philosophical experiment. How many of you are aware have heard of the trolley problem? A few hands. Okay, really quickly. It's one of these lovely philosophical experiments. There's a speeding runaway trolley. If it continues, it'll kill those 5 people strapped to the tracks. You, however, could throw the switch to have it kill only 1 person. Would you do this? Hands up if you would. Okay. That's a reasonable shot. So I guess the rest of you would just stand there and watch it run over the 5 people instead. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, it's up to you. So most people would generally throw the switch. The alternative is you could instead stop the trolley by pushing a very large person off a bridge into its path, which would have the same net effect, of course. No, someone would die, but at least those 5 would be saved. Would you do that? Any hands? No, it's guaranteed. It's guaranteed. It's a philosophical thought. See, there's always far fewer hands in the second option. And philosophers love to argue about why this is, because ethically they're exactly the same situation. They're exactly the same, except in one case you kill someone by pulling a switch, and the other case you pull someone by pushing them. But one of them evokes an ooh yuck response in people that makes us feel it's ethically wrong, because we know that it's ethically wrong to push people off bridges, but we haven't been trained up to be aware that it's ethically wrong to just throw a switch. This has all sorts of lovely implications for moral behaviour in daily life in humans. But what I'm pointing out is that these are 2 similar situations. People come up with all sorts of justifications to themselves for why one is right and one is wrong, but really morally they are no different. So I'm hoping to pose another trolley problem for you. This is relevant, honestly. I work with Moa bones, and this is exactly what our museum looks like. Yes, that's correct. But things got very interesting just a few years ago when Trevor Mallard, in an impromptu breakfast meeting in the hut, suggested that within 50 to 100 years, very important numbers, Moa could stalk the land once again. And of course, you know, he was pilloried in the press and mocked. I was one of the few people who actually defended him, because 50 to 100 years is a very long time indeed, so who knows? The public of New Zealand seemed reasonably split on whether they liked this idea. This is, by the way, the first and last time I hope we see the word de-extinction, which is a terrible phrase that I think we can surely find better alternatives to. But obviously the public aren't unanimous on this issue. And so this is where I guess this is a social license to operate. If we wanted to bring back more, we'd need to probably work on that. The discussions on bringing back more tend to be a little ill-informed because people aren't quite aware of what it entails. Here's a zebra. Here's an extinct subspecies of zebra called a quokka. It's obviously quite different. A recent breeding project attempting to revive this or resurrect this species through selective breeding produced this. And they were touting, they were very proud that they managed to bring back the quokka. And I show these 2 photos to people and say, well, have they? And nobody agrees. But this is the level, this is the sort of magnitude of wondrous success we might look forward to if we ever tried to revive moa or mammoths, as we get something like that. And people would not be tremendously pleased. They would feel a little bit ripped off, and I don't blame them. But this is the reality of species revival that we can look forward to in the foreseeable future, say, all the folks involved with it. So they're basically slapping some genes from one place to another and producing something that looks a little bit like something that's extinct. But the usual portrayal, of course, in discussions is this. So we've got a bit of a gap between perception and reality in this space. The discussion, strangely, when we start actually talking about what could happen with species revival, is this sort of thing, like what is the legal status of a resurrection? Would it be covered by the Wildlife Act? Would it be covered because it's genetically modified by the hazards? Who knows? I mean, no, it wouldn't be covered by the Wildlife Act because it's not in the schedule, and that would be rewritten at some point, and yes, it is a GMO. So, but I'm concerned that people seem to feel, and sociologists and legal guys love to throw in little conferences and seminars discussing topics like this and wringing their hands over the ethics of species revival and such like. There's going to be a long time before this is going to be an actual problem. We have a lot of time to talk about what would be the issue with reviving more, because it's not going to happen. Here's the one slide. Usually I spend half an hour on this. There's one slide. This is why we're not going to be reviving more anytime soon. All good? Excellent. Come talk to me after. So that's not going to happen. We'll have mammoths running around long before we have more running around. So we look at mammoths. There's objections that are usually posed when people start talking about things like reviving mammoths. This is one of the objections, is shouldn't we be putting our efforts into saving endangered elephants instead, endangered species instead of extinct ones? Because they're quite different things, and it's a zero-sum game, obviously. I wanted to talk about the perception that the endangered and extinct projects are completely different and they have no overlap, and raise the trolley problem. So here are some of the objections that I've heard, collected, people have said to me. These may seem familiar, like this is why you shouldn't bring back a moa, or indeed a mammoth, right? No, where would it live? Where would it live? And it would be terrible. And who would patent it? And the mammoths went extinct. Moa went extinct for a reason. Maybe why we haven't solved that problem yet. And of course, it's unnatural. It's just playing God. So there are a lot of standard objections that are raised to this, and people feel a collection of these are usually the justifications for why people have icky feelings about the idea of resurrecting species. I think reviving species is perhaps a better term to use than resurrection, which has all sorts of charmingly biblical, if we want to not be accused of playing God, perhaps that's the wrong word to use. So reviving species is usually faced with these objections. Let's just do a little bit of so this is a very technical graph, as you can tell, because it's drawn by hand. If we look at the species expenditure curve, and with the particular New Zealand context, how much does it cost to actually save a species? And as you can see, the numbers are extremely precise here. I'm sure the folk from DOC in the audience can give me, perhaps this is the equation that DOC uses, I don't know. But as you can see, the curve, it's relatively inexpensive to save things when there's thousands of them, and when you're down to 100 or even 10, it starts to become extremely expensive until you hit a point where you're down to just one, and basically that's where the line stops at the moment. It's important to note that there's a logarithmic scale and expenditure there as well. Of course, being New Zealand, we like to get started when near the top of that curve, not down at the bottom end. That's part of our charm, is that when something's in, we wait till it's about double figures before we really get moving. But the issue is that this current stop here, the difference between one individual and 0 living individuals, if it ever is solved, then the graph will go off the top of the charts. And if I were Al Gore, I'd have a little step ladder here. I could stand up there and show you where at some point it intersects with that y-axis. And its intersect point will drop gradually over time. But this is a continuum. So the difference between saving a species when there are 10,000 versus just one is very, very large. And it's perhaps closer to the difference between saving a species when there's 1 and 0. So in terms of scientific, you could put anything you like on the y-axis, scientific expertise or time or effort or money. But this is actually just a continuum, and we should look about reviving species as just saving a species whose extant population is 0 rather than 1, 2 or 11. So if we see them as a continuum, we can actually look at the same arguments that are used against species revival and see if they apply to saving species whose numbers are greater than 0. So to remind you, this is the usual sort of objection that's brought out to saving an extinct species. Now, if we switch it to an endangered one, we have to change a couple of the bits of grammar here. But basically, now, they become very different arguments when people try and apply them to saving something like a kakapo. And the arguments suddenly become almost ridiculous. All of us would scoff if we saw these arguments applied to solving a kakapo. We haven't solved the problem of why they need to eat as well. Yeah, no, we haven't, because New Zealand's still infested with critters, but we're not going to let kakapo get extinct just because there's hardly anywhere that they can live safely. That's just silly. If we put them side by side, we've got a trolley problem. So we have cognitive dissonance. On one case, all these arguments seem perfectly fair when applied to a species with a population size of 0, and ridiculous when applied to something with a population size of just 140. And yet they're on a continuum. There's not an abrupt distinction, and soon, well, at some point in the future, there will not be a great disjunction between saving one versus the other. It's just going to be a question of money. So we look at the black robin, which is down to, I believe, 11 individuals, one breeding female. And I wasn't around at the time when this conservation project started, but I'm sure there were people who were scoffing at that point. Back in the early 80s, I bet there were people who were convinced that this was a ridiculous project, that, where is the bird going to live? What are we trying to do? Have we solved the problem of why it went extinct in the first place? Aren't we just playing God? Should this be let to slip off? And of course, how can we possibly spend all that money saving just one little species when there are so many other endangered species that were on the verge of extinction? So, for example, compare the black robin to the Mercury Island tusked weta, which was down to literally a population size of 3. Three individuals collected in 1994 and bred, I believe, in ice cream containers at the point at which the wild population went completely extinct. So the entire world population of this saved species is derived from 3 individuals in ice cream containers, and a very low cost. I think it was just a few $1,000 it cost to breed hundreds of young and release them back onto a number of the Mercury Island group, which are now, and it's now doing just fine. Think of how many, insect equivalents we could have saved for the budget of one black robin. So when we look at this argument, it's much harder and more expensive to bring something back than conserve what we have. Well, let's put that picture in there instead and think, why did we save the black robin when we could have saved any number of far cheaper and less endangered critters? Ditto, the idea of resurrection is going to destroy the idea of extinction. We can just park things and put them on ice until it's convenient. Oh, we already do that. Yes, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work so well. So this is already, apparently a perfectly acceptable solution to conservation problems. And are we just playing God? Well, if you've seen the kakapo sex helmet, then the idea of breaking the laws of nature I don't think applies. So, which brings us to Sirocco. The key reason we're having this discussion needs to happen is that all of these techniques are going to be used first on endangered species, long before they're applied to the resurrection of extinct ones, and we need to have that public social license and that discussion first. Thanks. Sorry, a little bit over time.
Questions? Come on, I'm not letting you out of the room until there's been a decent number of questions. That's excellent.
Andrew.
So this came up yesterday, I think.
Big voice, big voice.
This came up yesterday, but I think with some of the... Oh, there we go. Thank you. With some of the discussion with Jan Wright as well. The other side of this is if we think it is a good thing to do, then how do we work to help the public have more appetite for risk around this technology, other technologies? If we think it were a way to go, is there a way to morph the appetite for risk?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'm hoping that there are, say, sociologists of science who are currently doing exactly these public surveys and discussions to find out where the push points and where the issues of vulnerability are for the public and what they truly feel about this. Not just one public, all our publics. So I think that's a really worthy project, and that should be built into any sort of conservation effort that might use these technologies in the near future.
and to comment to the first question, and I'm sure I'll come up with a question, Mike. Got it. We are starting to have that conversation about synthetic conservation and whether or not we do want to be thinking about using some of these technologies in our extant or living threatened species. And one of the things that I've noticed is that it's a slightly different conversation than, say, a GMO for something that humans might actually consume. So case in point, we talked about this in a third-year course last year that I was teaching, and I had 24 students, and we talked about gene drives, we talked about synthetic conservation, and at the end of that conversation, I said, okay, quick show of hands, who thinks within the next 50 years we'll actually be using this? 23 hands went up, and the only one that stayed down was from France. And so I think it's actually, I think there's an opportunity to have a really genuine, robust conversation, because I think there's less immediate fear in this space, because we're not going to eat a cockapoo right away, necessarily. And so I think
We can dream. Perhaps it's the long-term goal.
So I'm afraid I don't have a question. I've just made a comment.
That's great.
But I think this is a very important point which you all should write down. I think we need to move on.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
thank you.